When I came out in 2015, it was for the simple reason that I was finally ready. I had been wrestling with my sexuality for years. And if I had not deployed to Afghanistan, I might never have found the courage to come out. There's another part of the story that, frankly, even now, I have a harder time talking about. I think because it's hard to admit. I'm uncomfortable admitting it even now, even though it's something that maybe won't be so surprising. And it's the fact that when I was younger, I would have done anything to not be gay. If you had offered me a pill to make me straight, I would have swallowed it before you had time to get me a sip of water. It was a hard thing to think about now. It's hard to face the truth that there were times in my life when if you had shown me exactly what it was inside me that made me gay, I would have cut it out with a knife. Thank God there was no pill. Thank God there was no knife.
A big, powerful moment for Pete Buttigieg Sunday in Washington. The mayor of South Bend, Indiana, spoke in a deeply personal way to an audience of LGBT rights supporters about how he grappled with his own sexuality, describing it as a kind of war. During his speech, Buttigieg talked about coming out soon after he returned from Afghanistan, his early dating experiences, meeting his husband, and how he came to pen this op-ed in the South Bend Tribune back in 2015 in the lead up to his mayoral re-election, which he ended up securing with 80% of the vote. Buttigieg also called out Vice President Mike Pence by name over his opposition to gay rights. Mayor Pete recalled how Pence was the governor of Indiana during his re-election campaign.
I can tell you that if me being gay was a choice, it was a choice that was made far, far above my pay grade. And that's the thing I wish the Mike Pences of the world would understand. That if you got a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with my creator.
Heidi and the table are back. This guy is chicken soup for my soul.
This is Buttigieg. This is Obama's Reverend Wright speech. Early. I mean, this is a very, very impressive speech. I think back, it was just 12, 13 years ago when McGreevey basically had to step down for saying he's out. When documentaries like Outrage were still chasing people out of their positions. It is a reflection of how much progress we have made in this country. I'm not sold on Mayor Pete as a candidate. I think he's basically a centrist Midwestern Democrat. I think that his sort of strategy about Trump voters is wrong. I think that his history with firing that black police chief in his town is going to be a problem, and we need to investigate that much more. But in this particular area, as a candidate who can speak to a marginalized community in this country with faith and with passion and conviction, literally, it made me think of Obama. And that's the only candidate, the only Democrat so far this year that's made me think of the previous president.
You know, he's done something pretty impressive early, which is he's broken out a kind of AA level. Oh, the mayor of South Bend, you know, that's a glorified shopping mall. It's small. Nobody cares. He's now in the race. He's raised enough money. He's broken through nationally. He has an act. He has a shtick that will, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, he has something to say, which will ante him in. And he's competing with, I think, Beto for the big, I call it the golden retriever vote. Oh, finally a nice person. You know, which is a huge contrast to Trump. He's like Beto's smarter brother a little bit. So the two of them are surfing a big voter wave, which is worth something. Will it get them nominated? A lot of turns left to go. But I think as the yesteryear candidate, unfortunately, Joe Biden has started to wobble a little bit. The idea of somebody new and fresh is open, and you've got two pretty strong candidates. Now we'll see if they can survive the whirlpool for a year of running for president. Right. So far, so good. He got himself in the race. That's an accomplishment.
I mean, he's remarkably compelling. His story is transcendent to a lot of folks. I mean, he speaks powerfully about identity. He speaks powerfully about faith. He was a veteran. He's clearly an intellectual. You know, he seems to have a real ability to connect with people in a real deep way. Very different than, you know, and he could not create a more polar opposite than our current president. Right. So look, fast forward to what that election would be like. That's remarkable to think about. We're a long way from there. To your point, I think it's exactly right. He's already come much further than I think anyone would. There's a real buzz there. You know, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is considering getting in the race with very poor poll numbers and very little buzz. And that's not to say he can't turn things around, but the fact that a mayor of a city that's about 100,000 people versus one that's 8.5 million, and that he seems to have that energy behind him is a testament to how he's already connecting with people.
Heidi.
Nicole, in a time when we watch so many of these presidential campaigns devolve into candidates trying to dehumanize each other, I think he just inoculated himself in a certain sense. That was such a human moment. It was such a window into his pain, and he was willing to share that with the entire country. Really says a lot. But I think what he's also doing here is really interesting, fresh frontier in terms of campaigning on the issue of values. For a long time, this has been an issue that the Republican Party has felt has been kind of their strong point, their exclusive kind of argument on who has the values, who's the values party. Well, he's reframing that now in terms of Christianity being or practicing Christianity that appreciates all God's children. And he talks about contrasting that, for example, with Mike Pence. And we've seen him do that on a number of times here, Nicole, when he talked about Mike Pence championing the porn star presidency and contrasting that with his own marriage, where he also shared with us how his husband, walked him through a very difficult time with the death of his father. So I think he's going to be also kind of reframing what our Christian values and what our family values, not just on this, but in a number of topics. For instance, is it really Christian values to oppose abortion, but then once the child is born, to not give the mom maternity leave, to take away supplemental nutrition assistance? I think this is a bigger vein here that he's tapping into.
Let me just, you don't pay extra for this, but because I spent all of my career until 2 years ago as a political operative, let me just say this. We can't slice candidates up anymore the way we used to. We used to slice up the head and say, are they smart enough? And then we'd slice off the heart and say, do they feel your pain? And then we'd slice off the arms and say, do they hug babies well enough? And then we'd slice off the legs and we'd say, how do they move around the Iowa State Fair? That's over. This person will run against someone who has no shame. So there are three things you need to win if you're a Democrat. One, no capacity for shame. That speech was about a lot more than being gay in America. It was about saying, I am who I am and I have no shame. In fact, shame, take a hike. That person has to be able to speak to our better angels, but not ignore our evil ones. And his words to Mike Pence were, I'm coming for you, because it is not God's will that I feel shame, and it is above my pay grade that I'm gay, and it's above yours too, Mike Pence. And I swear people will make a decision based on how the candidate makes them feel. And that guy there, that guy makes me feel better.
Interesting, though, the political world, the consultant types, quietly.
The unemployed consultant types.
Well,
what do they do now, Mike?
No, there are fewest to employed on the Democratic side in particular right now. So here's the secret conversation about Mayor Pete. And I thought he did a very good job today kind of pointing the bow of his boat into this, which is after he gets out of Iowa and after he gets out of New Hampshire, if he does well, and head south, where the Democrats are older, more secular, more culturally conservative, particularly the African American.
I think Heidi hit on that. I mean, he's running a values campaign.
He's going to flip that coin, so they're going to work or it isn't, because he has to put that part of it together to be nominated.
Here's the thing. When I talk about, again, this issue with the firing of the police chief and the racial controversies in the city and the income inequality in the city, all these things are well and cute, but you have a city of 100,000 people, okay? The head of the University of Indiana system is actually in charge of more lives than Mayor Pete, right? So when you have a city that small, I expect something to be done. These are cute speeches, and all the chattering class, we're going to love it. But he's got to talk to Latinos, and he has to talk to black women, and he has to talk to African American men, and he has to talk to Asian Americans. Once he moves out of this nice, beautiful space of being the good suburban guy from college, college parents, I got to see that he can speak to the basic. He's also a war
veteran. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but he's also a veteran I don't take any of that from you, but he's more than a college-educated guy from a suburban family.
Right? But he's the kind of Democratic Party he has to communicate with though. I don't know that he's ready to do it, and we'll have to see. The
other question is, can he fight? They want a fighter. If I were him, I'd take a big poke at Bernie at the first debate.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.